we have quite a few around the globe, which is always lovely to see. We are today hosting a wonderful webinar. So it's actually part 2 of our series. We have 3 more that are scheduled, and we're reintroducing Miss Jerry Brewster, who's a registered dietitian and has been doing this for 3 decades, who will be hosting today's topics based on a lot of your feedback that you gave from the prior session. So we're really excited to continue to have Jerry's involvement in the AP community. She's equally eager to learn from all of you about, what challenges that we face, what questions we have, what we're observing about our amazing AP heroes, and then even personally as caregivers, things that we need to do to just continue to boost our own nutritional care and well-being, because that's equally important, right? So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Jerry, and Jerry, I'll just be on the presentation, so you can just tell me next slide.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Good morning, everybody. So, all right, I'll wait, I guess, for the first slide to come up. So, to begin. All right, so actually, the title of this is really more appropriately a discussion on brain and cognitive support and eating, because I won't be presenting specific protocol. Bina, you can go ahead and go to the next slide then, because primarily I'm really here just as a support for you guys for informational purposes only. So everything that I'm going to suggest, I'm really coming from a primarily food-based place as a clinical nutritionist. And while in my private practice, I often do make recommendations for closing the gap dietarily so that everyone can get their specific nutrients. This is a little odd this time around, Bina. I'm sorry, I'm just a little, because I see nothing or no one, but I'll see if I can change things around here. There we go. Although I like to see some of your faces as I'm talking, so I don't feel like I'm just talking.
Can you do gallery view?
Well, the thing is when I do gallery view, which is what I just hit, I wind up blocking half my screen. Let me see. Let me see if I escape on my end. Actually, that's good. That's good, because now, yeah, I just shrunk everything down. Okay, cool. So, so anyway, I'm really coming from a food-based place at this point. I won't be naming specific protocols per se or specific recommendations on dosages of nutrients or supplements that may be needed to augment a foundationally good diet. But you can always ask questions during the discussion, but then if you have a nutritionist that you're working with, they can guide you further after you hear some of the information I'm going to share today. So I wanted to just start with some terms to discuss, so which you're probably more familiar with, and then collectively we're all pretty familiar with these terms, but I just wanted as sort of a ground level beginning that pruning of the human brain, it occurs from birth like through adolescence, and that's really like the cleanup of all the neurons, right, which are the nerve cells that are communicating with one another via the synapses. And those synapses are the structure that lets the neurons pass information between themselves. Like a conductor, you often see like that synaptic connection between the two neurons, and that's that communication. And the BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that's a protein, a nerve growth factor that really acts on specific neurons that are responsible for cognition and long-term memory and the sensory integration that we ultimately see with pruning. Now I'm talking about everything that should be going on from a neural developmental standpoint, an ideal neural developmental standpoint. So this integration of everything is what helps refine all those reflexes, or those primitive reflexes that human babies are born with. So this is all that pruning and that fine tuning. And there are certain components of that really help add to this brain plasticity. We can kind of, I guess, go over to the next slide, Bina, on plasticity. So, and I apologize for any typos. I just sort of do a mind dump, and I should go back and refine a little better, but you get the general gist. Basically, in terms of plasticity and neuroplasticity, just like many years ago, the idea was that just like genetically, we thought we were hardwired in our genes. So, and that's it. And it was the same thing with the brain. The thought was just that, you know, once the development occurred, like, then that was it, that there wasn't the possibility of any real regeneration or ongoing plasticity or molding and connectivity of those synaptic connections, like that building up of the neurons and the brain cells. So, I'm sorry, can we go back? So anyway, one of the big things too that was found, besides the food piece, but is really the sort of that reverse engineering. Like, if the brain isn't strong enough initially to do all the movements, that if you do the movements, it kind of channels back up to the brain. So that's where the benefits of physical activity and occupational activity, even if it's passive exercise, really helps stimulate the brain. And this was seen early on with children with cerebral palsy, who way back when were just sort of left to be still that way, and the environment was adapted to them. But really making everybody work harder in infancy, and even passively moving all those muscles, it really helps brain plasticity. Now we could go on to the next slide. So there's a battery of good nutrients, foundational nutrients, that help all of this to happen. We touched on some of that when even in the first discussion on constipation. But what really helped the human mammalian brain make that leap from an evolutionary standpoint into more complex thought processes and cognition and intelligence, and was really the incorporation of animal fats into the diet. So that's everything from a nutritional anthropology and historical standpoint. So there are those important components that are found in, and you have to remember, from early man, even up until very recently, in terms of omnivore diet. So, and in all due respect to people who are vegans, and I'm going to touch on how you get all of these same nutrients from nuts and seeds and legumes and what have you, albeit it's better when those are like soaked and really prepared to help digestion and assimilation. But right now, just from sort of a historical perspective on brain development and some of those foundational nutrients that are necessary, majority of the literature has been on the addition of the animal fat component. So things like omega-3s, the EPA and DHA component. You can also get, even from the plant aspect, LA, right, which is linoleic acid, and which is an omega-6. But foundationally, we get those. We get choline and serine, which again can be extrapolated from legume sources, but we also get these from organ meats, because that was my train of thought a moment ago. That from early man's time up until more recently for omnivores, the whole animal was consumed because things were not wasted. So the organ meats and the bones, and hence bone broth now that has had a resurgence, because of the marrow and the proteins and the specific amino acids and compounds and minerals within that. So all of that is very brain nourishing. Although for anyone who kind of grew up in the 70s and 80s of just sort of that white meat chicken breast with like no fat on it and all, you know, we really went off the rails a little bit there. But that's a bit of a different discussion. So nonetheless, from a human evolution standpoint, this neuroprotective activity of all these dietary essential fatty acids and the choline and the serine and the omega-3s and specific omega-6s. Okay, so we're gonna move to the next slide. Thanks. And because for children with 8P, what's really vitally important, because we probably all know people, and maybe ourselves some of us may have grown up on diets that may have been kind of deficient in all some of the nutrients I already just mentioned, and yet you're fine, right? So you're like, you don't always need all that stuff. But when there's already been an insult to brain development, either in development or post-birth, right? Because again, with all of the regenerative work that's done for people with traumatic brain injuries, that a lot of this research has come from as well. Besides learning issues and attentional issues like ADHD, and the studies that have shown that increasing serine and choline and DHA and specific antioxidants that come from foods can really be nourishing to these neurons, these brain cells, for recovery and optimization. So for children with 8P, because of this agenesis, this undevelopment or absence of the corpus callosum, which is necessary to help integrate, right, which would otherwise even be part of that pruning system for organization of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We touched on a little bit of this in the constipation component because we were talking about muscle tone, right? But that is why you get then this downstream effect of cognitive difficulties and low muscle tone and coordination and feeding and swallowing difficulties.
And Jerry, I just wanted to add to the listeners that, you know, we know that with 8P, there are some that have this agenesis of corpus callosum. There are some that have partial thinning of their corpus callosum, right? And then there are some that are actually not as impacted or have no impact. Their corpus callosum is fully intact. So, you know, I just don't want, I want all of you to know that we're aware that there's kind of a spectrum in the 8P community.
Absolutely.
Almost based on specific genes that has impacted all of us. So I think Jerry's just trying to think, you know, speak very broadly. And
I am speaking very broadly, and thanks for clarifying that. Sure. So I just, you know, just in terms of brains and whether would be speaking to all of you as an 8P community or a group of parents with children with ADHD or a group of parents of children with autism, but of course there can also be all of those secondary diagnoses to any primary diagnosis. So yes, I am just indicating here from a brain development standpoint under the 8P umbrella of what could manifest that.
And I also wanted to point out that you've been saying all these wonderful nutrients and terms that maybe some of you are not as aware of, and it certainly took me quite a bit of an education over the past few years to even know, like, okay, what is choline, or what is serine, or what are omega-3s and omega-6s? And I think many of us might have heard a little bit more about the omegas, but in general, a lot of these nutrients can be found in our food and our diet.
That's why what I want to focus on today. That's why I said that I wasn't going to really be getting into protocols which might involve specific nutrient dosages or supplementation or support for brain optimization or cognition, because there are many of them, even, you know, again, even from a traumatic brain injury standpoint, whether it's even a concussion, so much information in terms of concussions, right? So we do know from that literature as well, and we know from that literature as well, that if your brain is really nutrient centric, right? If your body is that, if you get whacked in the head, the significance of the injury, if you have more nutritional resilience, you can lessen the extent of the injury as well as help improve your recovery from the injury. So as you said, Bina, a lot of this now, this is good general information. I'm going to try to certainly target it to 8P individuals and their caretakers, but this is then ultimately even for everyone. This is really for everybody to be aware of, and how we can reduce inflammation, including brain inflammation. I mean, this is really at the heart of sort of just preventing cognitive decline associated with age, you know. So we're trying to get to optimization, and then we're seeing how long can we extend that optimization so that we don't have to think that these age-related end products have to really manifest, right? So how can we maintain our sharpness that way? And one of the things too, which kind of comes up a little bit now as we're all sheltered in with COVID and all, while some people might find themselves eating more from a stress standpoint, a lot of people are eating less and more healthful because everything is just that feeling of perhaps a little more scarcity. So it makes us more cognizant of making sure what we get in to be nutrient dense. And again, when you look at all of the epidemiological data on different diets and different dietary intake during times of war or famine or what have you, and then even from the anthropological standpoint and human development, the idea is that we have been suffering these last 100 years from a glut of excess, specifically carbohydrates. And those excess sugars cause this glycation in the brain. I didn't even realize I would go off into this tangent a little bit, but it kind of just puts it all together for everyone, because all that excess sugar drives up inflammation. And that's why you see sometimes that like lower caloric diets, right? Or people who are going a little bit more like keto and really reducing carbs. And for some people with specific mitochondrial disorders or mitochondrial dysfunction, those mitochondrial components or within our cells, those are the powerhouse of our cells. They produce energy. They help get all that energy fallout out of our cells. So they're really the regulators, and they need a lot of nutrients, but they don't necessarily need a lot of calories. And what we've been suffering with are like an excess of calories and an insufficiency or deficiency of nutrients. So whether or not your child with 8P has any aspect of agenesis of the corpus callosum or not, this is a discussion on brain optimization and why physical activity, reducing dietary sugars and excess carbohydrates, and ramping up the antioxidants or those colorful components in vegetables and fruits are so beneficial. So for everybody. So, and especially anybody who has any type of neurological or cognitive dysfunction. So this is about optimization. Is that helpful? I don't hear anybody.
No, it's okay because I asked them to mute themselves. But if you guys wanted to, we're in the chat box, just like send out questions. That would be fine too. And I think, Jerry, if I can point them out to you as we go along.
Yeah,
if there's something specific
just
to the slide.
while I was talking, I saw something pop up, but
I addressed it. It was about an MRI of how to diagnose corpus callosum.
oh, okay, I see. All right, so hopefully that maybe set a little better stage, though, that explanation of the point of this discussion. No? Should I go on?
Yes, I think I'm getting some head nods, yes.
Oh, okay. I don't see anything. I'm only listening
Oh,
for
you don't see anyone?
I don't
Okay.
want to because it's too distracting. So
Okay.
I'm only seeing you. So
Yes.
and the slides and the chats that are popping up and trying
Yes, okay.
to thought.
We're getting good thumbs up.
My own sensory integration. I don't want to stress it out too much.
I think we're okay, and I just wanted also, because we're chuckling along, but I see there's also an 8P hero on the call who's amazing. So just wanted to let you know.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening. And I see something just popped up with regard to, but I don't want to open the whole thing and possibly, how do we help weight gain? What was that question?
Yeah, how do we help weight gain and control inflammation?
Oh, okay. Well, because weight gain doesn't have to be associated really just with sugars, right? With sugar consumption. So clean, healthy proteins and clean, healthy fats, right, can also deliver a whole lot of nutrients and calories, coupled with slow released carbohydrates. So, you know, it doesn't have to be like a sugary drink to necessarily just add calories. You want to make sure that it's got nutrients. So proteins, fats, and slow released carbohydrates or starches rather than.
Can you give us an example of a meal that looks like that?
Sure. And it depends on whether or not someone is, now, you know, again, all due respect to everybody's dietary preferences, but let's just say if you are a vegetarian or an omnivore, then it might be an egg with avocado on either a slice of sweet potato toast, right? Or depending on chewing skills, and it could be even like a sprouted bread, even whether it's a gluten-free sprouted bread or you know, one that is, because not everybody is following, say, a gluten-free diet. So, but it would be a combination meal like that, say for a breakfast or at any time. If you're plant-based or vegan, it would include soaked and cooked lentils and peas and cashews, and maybe a brown rice or a quinoa, so that you're getting complete protein. And then all of that could be prepared, and if it needs to be modified in any way from a chewing and swallowing standpoint. And then of course, to that kind of combination, I would really highly recommend also ample amounts of olive oil, just as a good monounsaturated fat that is associated with driving down inflammation in the cardiovascular system, and that includes the brain. Something along those lines.
Okay, that's great. And it made me think about, there's another question you can address later if you'd like to, is just, I think everyone wants practical examples. One question was, what could we,
slide while I answer that next question?
What we could put in our lunch boxes. So if you want to kind of save that for later.
Because some of those ideas may come up as I get through some more of the slides. So, so foundationally, I'm just going to note here in terms of the Mediterranean diet, and of course, again, if there's vegetarians or vegans, there's a spin on that aspect. But the idea is that it is really high in these good essential fats and antioxidants. So again, these antioxidants or polyphenols or phytonutrients. They are these plant-based nutrients, many of which people always hear about, resveratrol, right? That's the compound in red wine that has been found to be so beneficial to brain health. But resveratrol doesn't have to just be in wine. It's in the skin of red grapes. It's in nuts. It's in berries like blueberries. So when you might have heard or read different things in terms of like brain food, right? So often comes up eggs, if you eat eggs, and nuts and seeds, right? Walnuts and all kinds of nuts. And again, those can all be turned into nut butters and pastes or like a cashew cream, because cashews, when they're blended, have a very benign flavor. So you can just kind of add it to anything to make it more nutrient dense. So you could do like a cashew cream butternut squash soup combo, and that would ramp up calories to someone who needs to gain weight. Anything that's going in, if you need weight gain, should be nutrient dense. It should pack a punch. So especially if you have a child who might fatigue easily with oral intake, because that's a lot of work and coordination. So so I would always say, like, if you want them to get their vegetables, but vegetables don't contain much calorically. So you can add a little drizzle of olive oil. You can stir in some nut butter, but if you want something very bland, then use like the cashew cream. And that just really means taking, raw cashews that you could soak overnight in the refrigerator, drain them, throw them in your food processor. It's almost like a hummus, but it doesn't have the grittiness of hummus, right? It smooths out a lot more easily. And then you could stir that into any of the vegetables that are being given, just for more nutrient and caloric density. You could even, if you have eggs that you might hard boil, you could leave the yolk a little tacky on the inside, but that yolk also could be added to something and smooth out something, so that whatever's being given to eat contains the most nutrients in that smallest amount of volume, if volume intake is an issue, which it often can be, and hence the underweight or failure to thrive component. So just some thoughts there. And then meatballs, sort of like that power meatball, kind of like that power pancake, so to speak. Instead of just using like a flour for a pancake, you could use some almond flour, so that this way you're really making it more nutrient dense, ramping up that protein. And there are some protein powders that could be added to recipes to enhance. But the idea with this, the Mediterranean diet, is just foundationally lots of good healthy plants with lots of good healthy oils and small amounts of animal protein and fatty fish, which is the primary dietary source of these good omega-3 fatty acids. If you are a vegan, then you can get them from the nuts and seeds. It's not the same thing. Your body has to convert it, and it doesn't always convert very efficiently into those omega-3s, but you can get an algae-based EPA DHA supplement to enhance a vegan diet. So we can go to the next slide. And I think I saw another nutrition question pop up first, perhaps. Because maybe taking the questions throughout the discussion helps enhance the value of the discussion for all of you guys, because I'm here for you guys. So it is a challenge always to prepare the right amount of information for, and scaling it to everyone's needs.
So there's a question about talking about weight gain for infants and 8-month-old, that they're starting to introduce solids, but is very sensitive and struggles to gain weight.
So sensitive from an oral motor, like sensory integration sensitive, or sensitive from a biochemical response standpoint, like allergies and intolerances?
Christina, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to just answer instead of writing.
Allergic? She's allergic to things.
Yes, he's very allergic and reacted like to broccoli, sweet potato, and carrot. And he's also like intolerant to cow's milk.
Right. Okay. So what are you using for a cow's milk substitute that might be nutrient dense as a replacement?
So for now, I like separate the breast milk. So I give him the end of the, because I exclusive pumping, and I give him the end of the pumping session, like the
Okay.
fire and fat.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, so you can add you can add to the breast milk, a little bit of any tolerated oil could be added. And there are also just some proteins. See, there are powdered supplemental proteins that are plant-based. Most of them are legume-based. You'll see like yellow pea protein. I don't know, based on the sensitivities and the allergies, the legumes may be an issue. But there is a rice protein, which isn't the same as rice, whole rice from a starchy constipating standpoint. It's just the protein taken from it. And it can maybe help increase the amount of protein. You could add that to make what is being taken in the breast milk a little more dense. And then, or also even the medium chain triglyceride oils, which are often found even in, commercially prepared infant formulas, can add some calories. They might loosen the stool a little bit though, but, or as I said, even a little olive oil. Okay. So I would just start by taking whatever he's already ingesting, including that foundation of the breast milk, and trying to enhance the nutrient density of the breast milk.
And then you have a question as well about, I don't know if Will, you wanted to just ask Jerry directly and unmute yourself. It seems to be fine for us to interact during the presentation.
Sure, yeah, I don't want to derail it, but and this may not be the right time to ask this question, but we were curious about, every now and then our guy has like a very strong yeast smell in his stool, and that's often will be accompanied with like yeast infection around the groin area. And right before that, we've noticed he tends to be really irritable for like 3 or 4 days before that. It sort of like works his way through the system. So we just wanted to get your thoughts. Can you talk a little bit about the brain-gut linkage, if that's a real issue, and how that links back to inflammation potentially? And specifically with the yeast idea, just because we've seen that in his particular case. And then the more practical question, what kind of foods should we introduce or limit when we notice this cycle beginning to sort of naturally try to combat it? We do live in a pretty warm, humid climate, and that probably doesn't help.
All right, so so part of me wants to say that if I go through, if I go through the rest of the presentation, but that's okay. I want to answer this question now to some extent. But the short answer is yes, indeed, the gut-brain connection is so very, very real. And some of that from a physiological standpoint, I will be discussing as I go through the rest of the presentation. And the irritability or even silliness and giddiness and inability to attend or focus is all about the compounds that yeast, when it's growing in the body, proliferating in the body, and we all have a certain amount of yeast. It's about keeping an equilibrium between all of these bugs that live in us and on us and around us. So if there is a yeast overgrowth, it's going to throw off certain chemical compounds within the body that can actually leak from the gut into the bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier, influencing behavior. Now, yeast thrives in a sugary environment. So it's not so much about what you do to change the diet when you already see this happening. It's changing the diet in an effort to prevent it from happening, because yeast is pretty resilient. So you might also even talk to your pediatrician about just a a gentler antifungal that stays in the gastrointestinal tract, like nystatin. I'm not here to give you medical advice in that regard, but if this has been a chronic issue, and it's going to run a whole lot of other downstream issues over time, because an overgrowth of yeast will also cause a imbalance in good gut bacteria or flora. Yeast tends to run with a bad crowd. So non-beneficial or bacteria are going to start to overpopulate and thrive in this yeasty neighborhood. And those bacteria also throw off a lot of non-beneficial organic acids that can run interference with cognition and temperament and irritability. He's not going to feel good if he's all yeasty. And because it grows in that sugary environment, it's going to make the craving for sugar greater. And sugar raises insulin levels and supports general inflammation, systemic inflammation. This whole dysbiosis or imbalance of what's going on in the gut in terms of the bacteria and the yeast or fungal organisms there will also run interference in the ability to metabolize certain good nutrient vegetables. Oxalate metabolism becomes a big issue, and oxalates are found in a lot of these great deep green leafy vegetables and in all these nuts and seeds that I'm talking about. But if you build up this oxalate level and they can't get metabolized out, they can settle into other areas of the body, and they can cause irritability in that, because you can feel it kind of in your joints and in your mobility. So upsetting the gut can upset everything. So really establishing as healthy a microbiome is really tantamount to all health. And it's not just a matter of throwing probiotics in, because they'll just go to war. Like, you have to really work on reducing the feeding source for the yeast and cleaning out the yeast, and then putting in small amounts of the probiotics in to then replete and replenish. But otherwise, you're just going to make a big, he could get very gassy and bloated and more uncomfortable. So just throwing probiotics in on top of yeast is not going to get rid of yeast. So it's even more complex than that, but that's just sort of an overview. If any of that was helpful, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, the whole talk has been very helpful, Jerry. I just want to say appreciate that you're taking the time to do this for these parents and for us. It's really, really beneficial. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That's why I got to pass all of it forward for everybody to spread the word that the nutrition component is where it's at. So thank you, Will. So the thing is that these powerhouses of our cells, right, and these neurons, these brain cells, and they're throughout our body, right, that they run on these mitochondria. And these mitochondria, so this was perfect segue, because these mitochondria, the two places where we see so many are in the gut and in the brain, just like the glial cells. And there's a constant communication between the gut and the brain. So the thought was always, if your brain was stressed, there was going to be like this downstream upsetness to the gut. But really, when the gut is upset, it's upstream, and it puts a lot of pressure on our brain. So supporting healthy mitochondria. So I already talked about, I know we don't want caloric restriction per se in this population, but it just means eliminating that glut of sugary, excess, unnecessary calories, right? Everything being nutrient dense, but we do want to support optimal growth and development. So the 8P kids have their own set of needs, and then every kid and every adult has their own set of needs. There is not really always a one diet, a one size fits all. So the CoQ10, riboflavin, is a B vitamin. So CoQ10 it's a compound that we can find in foods. Again, a lot of the For the omnivores, it's in the meats and the fatty fish and the organ meats. So the fatty fish also brings us back to the Mediterranean diet. It's also in the nuts and the seeds and the legumes. So on that vegan or more vegetarian side. The B vitamins like the riboflavin or B2, that's pretty ubiquitous, thankfully. N-acetylcysteine, it's a sulfur-containing amino acid. Again, that one will come from the nuts and the seeds and the legumes, but also from like the dairy and the eggs and meats. Again, you want, but see, I keep talking about vegetables and nuts and seeds and clean animal proteins, right? And oils, right? So there's everything I'm talking about. And then when you look at sort of the average American diet, or that SAD, that you know, it's a bagel in the morning or a bowl of cereal. It might be like, oh, a buttered roll and a Snapple, or for the adults, a coffee in the afternoon, a slice of pizza at night, and boom, another day is gone. The next day, it's like a repeat of the same with maybe like some breaded chicken at dinner, and maybe once a week, like a stalk of broccoli. Boom, another day is gone. So every day as time goes on, we're building up more inflammatory, calorie dense, but not nutrient dense intake, and we're driving down those opportunities of getting those nutrients in. And those nutrients are also so essential to eliminating toxins that we get from our environment, which is in another slide actually, but just some of these other components. So the cruciferous vegetables, really rich in these sulfur and methyl groups, which support all kinds of cellular function and detoxification. The carnitine, also, I think we touched on it, I believe, also in terms of the constipation component, because there's linkage there on that, because it's really very important for muscle function. And the alpha lipoic acid and acetyl L-carnitine, or L-carnitine in that acetyl form, which really gets into the brain as an antioxidant, because if you oxidize, right? Oxidation is like rust, right? So you want to prevent rust in the brain. Like sugars make that glycation, that's like rust in the brain. So you need to antioxidize it. So that all drives down inflammation. It also drives down inflammation by helping the body eliminate a lot of these inflammatory compounds that we come into biochemically. Next slide. Where am I going here? I'm a little off the rails, but I'm going to try to get us back.
And exercise. That was on the last slide.
Okay. So, right. So here already a lot of this I have touched on, even in terms of answering some of the questions. And I think there might be some typos in here. I was just trying to kind of make a flow chart to sort of pull all of this together. So these glia cells that are also in the gut and in the brain, and they're communicating, right? There's all that cross communication and crosstalk. That's all part of cellular memory, right? That's why for someone who knows they have, say, even a life-threatening allergy to, say, a peanut, visually all they have to do is see peanuts, perhaps if they've had a real shock to their system with it, because you're going into shock when you go into anaphylaxis. You can see it visually. That memory is going to trigger a physiological response, and that adrenaline will start pumping up, and some shortness of breath might occur. It's the same thing if I told all of you to just think about lemons and lemon juice, and just think for a moment what the smell of lemon juice smells like. You're going to increase the salivation, right, in your mouth. That's cellular memory. So every time we bring a good food in or a bad food in, our body's either creating that cellular memory like, wow, we've got relief here, or no, this does inflammation. This, I know where to go with this. Now I'm going to create more inflammation. So anyway, next slide, because I think we're on a time limit and I am only halfway through what I wanted to discuss. But anyway, I think a lot of these compounds in terms of this nutrient brief, I've already touched on in one way or another, so we can move forward from there.
Sure. And what I'll do is, maybe it's a good idea. We can, you know, this is a webinar series and we can continue these topics, right? So we're kind of glossing over quickly, and I look at this as still introductory for all those that are listening on this call. And we'll check in on the recorded session later, but you know, we can kind of dive deeper into all of these topics with Jerry, and we'll just have to continue scheduling them. So I just wanted all of you guys to feel assured that, you know, if there's interest, I strongly encourage all of you to either email Jerry, her contact information is at the end as well, and you can ask me at info@project8p.org and just email directly. Katie Syverson is also helping with these webinars and putting it together for the community. So she's on this call, and you can touch base on Facebook. I just wanted all of you to know that, again, these all require a deeper dive. And so we just want to hear back from the community that there's interest in that, and we will continue doing this.
Yeah, and
okay.
I can't really discuss one topic without there being an overlay from, you know, to the, like, there's even, you know, I've already referenced some of the constipation discussion that we had last time. So everything is interconnected because this is the body, and then it's what nourishes the body. So, so here was also a little more information just in terms of neuromodulation, this idea of how to really regulate the body. Because don't forget, in that synaptic region and communication between the neurons, that's where all those neurotransmitters are firing. So we've heard terms like dopamine for attention and alertness, and serotonin for calmness and happiness and modulation, but also for alertness too, or I should say focus, right? Because we have to be calm in order to focus. If we're all ramped up from adrenaline coming from our adrenals, those two glands that sit on top of our kidneys, if we're ramped up and we're in that fight or flight stage, that's where why I'm mentioning here that balance between parasympathetic nervous system to kind of like hold us, and then that sympathetic fight or flight, how to modulate that, right? Without, especially in a child, because without all that solid nutrition, okay, sorry. It's good.
Sorry, I hit my cursor and I didn't realize I was going through the slides.
Oh, that's okay.
I
I felt like Lucy in for those of you who might familiar with the Chocolate Factory, and the line started going a little quickly. All right. So, but the idea of this neuromodulation to help balance, right? Like how to rein it in when we do get that sense of anxiety sometimes, because in a small child who might spend a lot of their time in fight or flight, which they understandably learned if there was a lot of, say, medical interventions early on that were not comfortable, right? Now we really want to nourish and calm that response so that we can always have this better modulation, so we're not always in that fight or flight learning component. So thanks, Katie. I see you answering the question there for everything. So this vagus nerve, which is the largest cranial nerve, right? This is the gut-brain connection. This goes down into the gastrointestinal tract. And there's so much information, so we can move on, I guess, to the next slide, I think, as sort of a little bit more of a, yeah. So it really ties together this neurogastroimmune triad, because all of this is interrelated. And what really makes this communication body-wide are those microbes in our gastrointestinal tract. So they are creating the compounds that can then travel to the brain and really be responsible for modulating an optimal human being, because this is that connection. The neurogastroimmune system, it's almost like one system. And yet we break the body up all the time, and we're not always considering what's going on in the brain, maybe a result of what's going on in the gut. I think we talked about it with the constipation, that just how mood and ability to attend can change when a child can have a really good evacuation. All right, next slide. I will try to stay on point here a little better. So that leads us right into that, and I must have had this train of thought. I kind of forgot about it, but so the fiber component, which comes from all these nuts and seeds and vegetables and more complex starches like sweet potato or brown rice, right? That is responsible for producing in the colon, not just the fiber for the physical evacuation. And again, that's why I talked about how even if your child is reliant on Miralax for bowel movement and it does the job and it gets them to have a bowel movement, you cannot abandon the need for and benefit of dietary fiber, because dietary fiber in the intestine and specifically in the colon is responsible for the production of butyrate in our body. And butyrate is so necessary for all of the barriers, all the integrity of good barrier function in the gut, so that proteins and poisons from the gut don't leach into our bloodstream and then stimulate this over immune reaction to go after it or react to it, right? Because that puts in motion inflammation. So it's like a little inflammation is important, right? So you want your eyes to water and tear if they're hit with an irritant. You want to sneeze and eliminate any irritants and allergens. We make a little congestion to try to help push the infection out, but it's when that goes over the top. The same thing even with cholesterol. Cholesterol is there in the body as it reduces inflammation. It's a huge neuroprotectant. That's why breast milk is so high in cholesterol. And if a woman's ever had her blood checked during breastfeeding, it's through the roof, because it should be, because that cholesterol is so important. And even in the Mediterranean diet, where you saw like a lot of those nuts and seeds are sources of beta sterol and all. And beta sterol people think about as like a prostate help, because it reduces inflammation of the prostate, but it's because it's like a cholesterol component and it can reduce inflammation. But the issue is when we wind up having too much cholesterol, it's just like, it's too much of a response, right? This is the same thing with COVID. It's when all that body's immune system is so dysregulated that it goes into hyper gear that it destroys the host. So it's about making sure we have all these nutrients and this good gut health, which also fiber helps with this production of butyrate, which you can get dietarily, as I noted here, like butter and ghee are rich sources of it. Egg yolk is rich sources of it. So again, we're kind of going to the animal side of things for a moment, but it helps keep that gut intact and also the brain barrier intact to reduce inflammatory compounds getting to the brain. Lots of science here, so it's hard to kind of keep it general, but I'm hoping things will resonate. And then to Bina's point a moment ago, we'll continue to fine tune this, because I'm just here to share and serve you guys with information. Next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us back to the probiotic component. And the prebiotics, right? So in order for the good bacteria to even flourish in the gut, they need something to feed off of. Like the yeast feeds off of sugar. It's the fibers that serve as prebiotics. So like I wrote, the jicama and different greens and garlic and chicory root, which is also inulin, which you'll see as an additive in a lot of probiotics, and or Jerusalem artichoke. The thing is, though, is some of these prebiotics, especially if you have a lot of not good bacteria living in your gut, can increase some gas and bloating. So again, everything has to be very personalized. So first we clean up the diet and we get a nice nutrient-dense, fiber-rich, low inflammatory, lower sugar diet going in. and then we can kind of sprinkle our probiotics in, which don't necessarily have to be, you know, a supplement form. They can be a dietary form, as again, how they always were in the old days in traditional diets, regardless of what part of the world you came from. It didn't always have to say be a yogurt. It could have been a fermented vegetable, because this is also a way of preserving food, like pickling, right? So, so as I note here, lower carbohydrates and lower sugars and more healthful fats and omega-3s and organic food sources, at least non-GMO, because genetically modified food organisms do disrupt the microbiome. And this is another factor. And glyphosate too, which is the Roundup, so the pesticide. So if you're getting organic or mostly organic, that in and of itself includes non-genetically modified organisms. So just these cleaner sources of real whole food. Next slide, please. Serves as the best backdrop. So when we clean up the gut and prevent all that gut inflammation, we can prevent brain inflammation. You can read this slide as well as I could, but it's basically just kind of, I guess, ultimately summarizing a lot of what I just said, but all of these statements are supported in the literature over and over and over again, that good gut diversity and low exposure to antibiotics, better health. Antibiotics can be life-saving though. I mean, I probably wouldn't be here if there weren't for antibiotics. At least a couple of times in my life, I had some pretty life-threatening infections. So unfortunately, but I'm here to tell the story. But that's because things sometimes are necessary medically, but you need to do things then to mitigate the fallout, because they'll get rid of that initial infection, but they will leave side effects and disruption in their wake. And that has to be cleaned up. So that can be cleaned up by maintaining a very healthful diet, like what we've been talking about, and then maybe repopulating the gut with really some good bacteria post that antibiotic onslaught. Reduced diversity is associated with a lot of disease conditions. And we know about this now because we can do these comprehensive stool analysis and really look at the different bacteria forms. And we know that there are certain bacteria forms that are more associated with obesity, and there are certain bacteria forms that are more associated with being lean. So we just really want to focus on good gut health and a lower inflammatory diet to optimize total health and neurological health. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, okay. And then the flip side of that is, besides driving and all the good stuff, we want to reduce the input of the bad stuff. So, you know, environmentally, we do our best, but our environment is loaded with toxins and what are also called like these persistent pollutants, these forever chemicals, persistent organic pollutants or POPs, and these forever chemicals. So, you know, between heavy metals and pesticides and herbicides like the glyphosate or Roundup exposure, it all contributes, right? And to this inflammatory load on our body and this disruption. Now, again, if you got a lot of antioxidants and good nutrients on hand, it can help detoxify. That's why I said before, like the liver needs all of these nutrients, the brain needs all of these nutrients, the gut needs all of these nutrients. So one cherry tomato and one stalk of broccoli and maybe half of a peach over the course of a week is not going to do it. Every day, your diet should foundationally include lots of colorful vegetables and fruits. Sensitivities and allergies aside, and maybe that's where sometimes the nutrients that are missing from the elimination due to allergies and sensitivities, those have to go in and be compensated for. I mean, I spoke to a young woman yesterday, just 30 years old, who reached out to me about issues for her 8-month-old. But when I took mom's history, mom had a history of being on a proton pump inhibitor for 15 years out of her 30 years of life without any nutrients to compensate. And she has a whole slew of health issues and was very inflamed when she went into that pregnancy. So proton pump inhibitor is like Acifex or Prilosec or Prevacid or Nexium, and they may be necessary at times to put out that fire. But rather than the dietary changes that would have reduced the severity of her reflux, she was never advised from the time that she was 8 years old with severe reflux and food issues and sensitivities, but the diet never changed, unfortunately. Treating the symptom was changed, though that reduction in acid reduces the absorption of essential nutrients. So then she spent her later 20s battling a lot of fallout issues from that. Anemia, musculoskeletal problems from lack of absorption, had a hip surgery because she tried to be a runner, et cetera, and then went into a pregnancy. So we have to optimize our well-being, and when medications are necessary, we have to look at the nutritional side effects and we have to mitigate those so that we are at least, you know, it would have gone a long way for her to have been given some nutrients to compensate for the lack of absorption of those nutrients from years of reliance on a medication that ran interference with their absorption during her growing years, her formative body years. And now she has a body that has to last her forever, that doesn't have the bone density it needs. So this is just to get you thinking about things and for your own health and well-being. So diet is a major influencing factor of genetic expression. Gets back to my opening statement, which I didn't even realize that it would, that our genes are not hardwired, just like our brain isn't hardwired. They are going to express themselves based on what they're exposed to. And that exposure really comes in the way of our food. But different dietary therapies and restrictive diets and the tendency to be picky eaters can kind of all further narrow that nutrient intake. So I think we're going on now finally into the picky eater portion of this conversation, because I know that's a big issue. So, so these are all the problems. Any good cookbook recommendations? Not off the top of my head, because there are so many. So, but I will get you that information, because there are. I just am like on a train of thought here and I'm cognizant of the time. So I'll give that information to Bina. So, all right. So this is a common issue, certainly, and regardless of diagnosis, because psychologically it's a way of a toddler controlling their environment, learning how to test the waters. So there's a big kind of behavioral component that can go on as well as the fact that they're also now, they're really trying to take in their whole environment, right? And it could be very sensory overloading. So they want to stay with something that is familiar and comfortable and isn't going to really bombard their senses. So sometimes just those blander, beigeur foods. But the continued avoidance of the nutrient-dense foods can lead to the problems that we're looking to prevent. And then picky eating is also associated with anxiety and sleep issues, depression, and ADHD in the literature, but it's kind of like a chicken-egg situation, right? Because you're nutrient deprived, so you get those conditions, and then once you get those conditions, it makes you a little more rigid, and then then you become more of a picky eater. So, but also a lot of it is this oral sensory misreading in the mouth. Sometimes it just doesn't feel good by virtue of the texture. So sometimes we're aiming to stimulate texture and intake, but it might be too advanced. So we have to decide what we're going for first. Are we going to go for changes in flavor first from a variety standpoint and desensitize to that, or are we going with changes in texture? But it's really hard for a child to maybe organize in their mouth and their brain two new components to register, a new taste and a new texture at the same time. That's why it's okay to introduce a new type of food into a texture that they're already comfortable with. So I'm okay with blending things in at first. I'll go to some questions in just a moment. Hyperactive gag reflex can make a child very protective as well and make them say no to certain foods. Just that poor oral motor coordination, weak digestive function. If you're not feeling good in your belly, the last thing you really want to do is to consume something. So again, the bowel movement issue is important because that helps. And certain drug side effects, depending on medications. If anti-seizure medications, a lot of medications are going to run interference. Next slide, which is a little bit of maybe solution standpoint. So the idea first of desensitizing before even going into the mouth. So I always would say from years ago, working with families in early intervention and with feeding therapists, and this very purposeful desensitization of smelling different smells and touching things. And that's all important, but it's in that therapeutic environment. And it used to make me think about how, just from a societal standpoint, things have changed, because very often if a child was home, you know, in my day, school was kindergarten. Very few of us went to pre-K. So I don't really know that anybody born, you know, I guess pre-K was around maybe in the 50s and early 60s, but I'm not sure. You went to kindergarten. But so you spent a lot of those early years at home where somebody was in the kitchen. So you were naturally desensitized. There was the smell of food being prepared. There was the chopping and the visual. So that was all, unbeknownst to anybody, a way of sensory desensitization occurring, as opposed to when everybody's out of the house, like even I was when I had my kids, were out of the house in the morning and then you're in the house and dinner is like, you know, either pre-prepared or something. There's not that big buildup to dinner being put on the table. Right now, it's a little bit of a shocker because it just, boom, time to eat, here it is. And there's been no desensitization. So right away, you're just gonna want what comforts you, and that's what's familiar. So the last thing you wanna do is see something new and start learning something new, especially at the end of the day, because dinner is kind of where this time is supposed to be taking place. So you have to just think about all of that's leading up to that. Because we do want to just have all of that exposure before the meal is presented. Otherwise, especially if you don't have the most organized neurological system, it's kind of like somebody just dropping an ice cube down your back. You're like, whoa, what is this? So sometimes even without the smell, I've even suggested to parents to just put colorful tablecloths under their child's plate of the food they're familiar with first, just so they start associating eating with seeing green and yellow and orange and red. Because if they're just eating on a wooden table surface or a white table surface or whatever the table surface is, they're not even getting the visual desensitization of associating color with intake. So that's a suggestion. And then the repetition component. It is so important, but it's in those two different areas, taste and texture. So don't bombard all at one time. I have already made reference to this neuronal circuitry that fits into memory and that cellular memory and how it has to be associated with something good, because if it's associated with choking or an allergy, it's going to be rejected. And also everybody eating together and that social aspect, and children are more inclined to eat what they see. You know, that's why historically people will say, it's like, oh, they never eat that for me, or they'll only eat that for grandma. I mean, it's just, some of that can be a behavioral thing. They figure that stuff out right away. But some of it is also just about that sort of culture of eating. And if your child is able to participate in any way, shape, or form in meal preparation, even if it's just to play with the food at first, like help mom mix this, or help mom, whatever, even if it's just a squish, it's just a touch, they don't have to eat it. And then of course, ultimately the preventing constipation to optimize hunger and interest in intake. which we touched on a little bit last time. And I think that's going to bring us to the last slide. Oh, wait, nope, not, yeah, well, second, yes, this is the very last slide. So a couple of other thoughts. Don't let your kid be so filled up on fluids, right? Listen, if you're using those fluids to get necessary calories into them, that's one thing, but you might want to spend a day or two maybe reducing or eliminating those fluids if you're looking to increase an interest in solid food. So you don't want to starve them out, but if that may be the issue, so maybe switching to water for a day or two and just monitor the appetite response. Definitely avoid those sweets if they are inclined to sweets. It does reduce the appetite. Don't overwhelm. It's a long process. It's not an all or nothing. And every week, every day, every week, and every month, your child is learning new things. So just because you tried broccoli 6 months ago and they rejected it, don't think it's off the table for the rest of their life. So it's that variety over time, and it's also the presentation. So whether it's even like, it doesn't have to be a bento box, but it could be like muffin tins, right? Because sometimes kids do like things separated. And then it's kind of like a little bit of a smorgasbord, and it could be playful, and it's like a game. And you do have to do all of that stuff. And the airplane thing. And I'm okay with following a kid around to get a little bit of food in that they should have consumed more of. They can also be learning to like sit at a table and attend all the time while trying to get just watch the load of demands that are on them at any time. And again, I'm talking about big generalities and a variety of skill and physical abilities here, but just some considerations. And now I think the last slide calls for Q&A. Yep.
So thank you so much, Jerry. And I know that we're a little over the 1 hour, as I suspected, because we were trying to lump in 2 topics with the picky eating as wellness. But I'm sure there's a couple more questions. I just wanted to be mindful of your time. So I
can go. I have a phone consult with a client I can at 1, so on my time, so I can go like another 15 minutes. I'll need a little turnaround time, but I can go 15 minutes, or whoever wants to stay on the call.
Okay, so I know that, I don't know if Wendy is still on.
I just opened up the chat too on my end, so maybe I can.
Oh yeah, Wendy's on. Wendy, if you wanted to, I know you talked about picky eating with some allergy concerns. If you're listening and you wanted to unmute yourself and ask, feel free to ask directly. There you go.
I don't know if can you hear me?
I can, and is this your question then about just mostly crunchy snacks?
Yeah, that's pretty much all. That's my question, right? And he's allergic to peanuts, nuts, and coconut as well. So, but the biggest problem is behavior and sensory. I mean, we've been through feeding therapies, to try to get him to get new foods, you know what I mean? But nothing,
Right. Okay. So a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One, that I am hoping somewhere you're at least closing the gap on the micronutrients. The macronutrients, the proteins, fats, and carbohydrates from a caloric intake standpoint is one thing. Because you said he's also underweight. So he's obviously not necessarily even getting enough of those macros, but because of his limitations of interest of what he's consuming, he's definitely not necessarily getting micronutrients. And I might have actually had it in one of the slides. I should have made more mention of it. Zinc or zinc deficiency. And, zinc is going to be coming from animal products and fish and nuts and seeds, which he cannot eat, and meat products, which he doesn't eat. And I don't know if you have him on just a good multivitamin to close the gaps on his micronutrients, because zinc insufficiency definitely reduces taste and olfactory senses and is associated with a complete disinterest in intake. So that's one consideration, is just at least getting his micronutrients supported while you're working on getting more into him. I don't know what he's willing.
Can I throw a warning in there though? I think that when general consumers think about a multi, you're not recommending like the Flintstone gummies. You're right. So I just wanted to clarify.
But that's why I said in the beginning to, you know, you want to work with someone who can really advise you.
Yeah.
Because, and the thing is that even if it's like a, you know, if your child's on, say, like a commercial baby infant drop or something, that's not comprehensive, and that may not really have any of the minerals. Again, this does require a more personalization, but in generalities, right? A clean, comprehensive, and there are many of them, and you know, that's going to provide at least the RDA for zinc. But if there's a beverage that he drinks, you can also work on enhancing that beverage, even with just some benign proteins. And because he's going to be more sensory just from an insufficiency of good amino acids and complete proteins as well as nutrients. That's going to just continue to exacerbate that sensory component. From the crunchy side of snacks, maybe you have to color desensitize him too, because then maybe he would be willing to do crunchy snacks like kale chips that, you know, that you could make in the oven. Or they sell kale chips, but they're expensive. So the same thing even with some of the dehydrated or crispy, crunchy, the dehydrated, they're very crunchy vegetables and fruits that you can get at various stores, like, you know, the whole food type of stores, or Trader Joe's, or wherever you are, that you can get some variety of cleaner dehydrated foods. You could even get a dehydrator, because if he likes crunch, you can dehydrate anything. So so you could start moving in that way from a variety as well, and kind of meet him first where he's comfortable. But you might have to really start also, like I said, with the colors and if he can participate in anything. But I think if you round out his micronutrients, you might also find that he'll open up a little bit more too. If you're in the you know, here in the States too, and he's willing to drink something, maybe something along the lines like a Kate Farms beverage, a plant-based beverage. I'd have to look at all the ingredients in some of those, just based on that, but there are no nuts in it, so that part should be fine. I know there's a bit of a vegetable blend in it.
Those green smoothies, the Bolt House Farm ones, we're in the New York City suburbs. So, you know, we have access to a lot of things.
I'm not a big fan of those, to my recollection. I think they are not organic, so I think the pesticide load in them might be high. I think that a lot of them also have an apple juice base, or maybe I'm thinking of the naked juices.
Yeah, I think you're right.
They have apple juice, but even the Bolt House, I would find an organic juice like that if it's easy for him and he's willing to take that. That would be great foundationally.
Yes, I'll try to expose him to a few more things. Drinking is even worse for him. He doesn't drink water, and he only drinks 3 very specific things out of very specific cups. So
what are those 3 things?
Field smoothies, the yogurt smoothies. He drinks 1 Apple and Eve Fruitables juice boxes. It's vegetable juice mixed with fruit juice. And occasionally he'll drink certain orange and mango blends.
All right, but juices. You know what? The orange mango one has a strong taste, so you might be able to even get like a little bit of an orange omega mixed in that, as at least to get him some omega.
He does. He takes Core Omega. He takes Core Omega, the orange flavor.
Right, so you are doing
and a couple other supplements. Yeah, a couple of others.
Okay, but the thing is, the same way that he was willing to accept and figured out that he liked those items, maybe you can just continue to offer other items the same way you offered those.
It feels so hit or miss, you know, like he chooses, you know what I mean? If he's, you know, if he chooses,
I
but
don't
most of the
know
time we
where
can't
he
get
is
near
from
him.
yeah, I don't know where he is from a, you know, age-wise or developmentally or anything, but you can give him choices, because maybe you could say, well, you're going to have this or this, and they could be two new things, but he gets to pick one of the two new things. That makes him feel a little more empowered. And then, and if he's open to being incentivized.
He's 13, so he's a little set in his ways. He's not little anymore, unfortunately. You know, it's harder as they're older, I think.
Don't write that script for him that he's set in his ways, because we can't really, you know, you're giving him that power. He's not so set in his ways. He's only 13. He's got a long way to go. And
I'm just saying, he's been through feeding therapy, so he kind of knows the game, you know, of us trying to introduce new foods.
will he
So he's
respond
often
to being incentivized?
suspicious.
Can you incentivize him?
No. ABA doesn't work for him. Rewards don't work. No.
You can't get him to participate in any food prep, even if he doesn't have to eat it, just as a way of desensitizing him.
He'll stir things, you know. He can't chop. He doesn't have the fine motor, but he'll stir things. I mean, we've always done that, but he wouldn't eat it.
Everything that you learned from the feeding therapy and everything that I've suggested all kind of has to get pooled into a little bit of some of it every day. You really want to try to avoid having 1 or 2 days go by without having this introduction or desensitization or exposure or participation or choice. You don't want to let 1 or 2 days go by that one of those options isn't being presented to him, because it has to be that way. The same way it was vital to get him to brush his teeth and go to sleep, because these are good for his body, is the same way you're going to continue every day a little bit of all of these options. And boy, it is tedious and exhausting. But if you can then look back when he's 14 and see some progress, so maybe he'll be at 5 juices or drink types, that's still progress, because then maybe by 15 he'll be up to 8, and that's better than the 3. And maybe he'll be willing to take them from 4 types of cups rather than just 3. It's slow and it's tedious and it's exhausting, but it will all serve him, because this is also learning new patterns. This is also for anyone, for you now to learn a new language can gain years of cognitive success. So this is all, think of it not even just from the food piece, but just all part of just this whole body-wide exercise of benefit. So it becomes part of like his learning curriculum. So every year he'll make little gains, and that's important as long as we're moving that line forward.
I just wanted to say something.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Wendy, thanks so much for sharing. I think that often when we kind of ask personal questions, there's so many emotions just going through my own head about like, oh my gosh, like this is difficult. We're all in this. I thought of an idea that some people have been sending me some private messages and throughout Jerry's presentation, that I wonder if as just a community of parents and AP heroes, that we can just have a discussion and share these things and suggest and truly understand that it is so difficult. Like I mean, my daughter's only 7 years old, and you know, every year that goes by, I'm like, oh, we gained 1 pound, you know, and celebrate that. And it's sad, but so I just wanted you to know that like, we're so grateful, and I'm personally thankful for you to talk about this, because I think Jerry's responses to it hopefully helps all of us, with the little infants to, you know, the ones that are on the call that have adults as AP heroes. So I do appreciate both perspectives, and I hope all of you are gaining a lot from these perspectives.
I would hope so. And Wendy also, which I'm sure you know from all the years of feeding therapy and all those tricks, and he may be aware too and already not be interested, but just things, of course, about, you know, whether it's just toothbrushing before eating, right? We always do it after, but before, just to kind of wake up that whole mouth and get all that sensory stuff together. So when he was younger, it might have been like a nuck or a chew stick or something to engage him. And now you have to think of other ways, maybe sneakily, to get him a little prepped before that meal time. And maybe sometimes it's also even about adding structure to the day, because when kids are very selective, I have found that parents tend to let them, I'm not saying this is in your case, but again, I'm just trying to reach everybody and as my thoughts are going, parents will allow them to graze because they're just so happy that they're willing to eat anything at any time. And sure, I respect that certainly, but sometimes the idea of a more regular eating environment and setting can also help to establish just sort of new food rules, which will then lend themselves to a little more expansion, because sometimes it can even allow a little greater hunger. So rather than having something like every hour, so they're never really so hungry. So there's like snacking and nibbling all day. So they're just different things to think about. So even if he winds up having the same amount in the course of a day, but you reorganize it into 3 meals a day for a trial, then he might actually get a little hungrier, and then you could offer something new. And I think I had it on one of the slides, but I didn't mention it. It's always important to add the new item at the start of the meal when somebody's hungry. Of course, you run the risk of them knocking it right out of your hand that they're hungry and it's not what they want, but you know what I mean. So
It's been wonderful. I'm going to try the dehydrated vegetables. I honestly hadn't thought about that one for a while, you know? So that was you just have to put these things out, and it could be the littlest thing. So thank you so much.
We have to all shake each other up. A lot of people come to me even from just sort of different health issues, or as a diabetic or something. They're like, I know I'm not supposed to be eating, and you're not going to tell me anything that I don't know. And I'm like, I may not, but I could maybe give you the science behind it to incentivize you a little bit more, so you're not just thinking that it's like this, don't eat this and eat that, or whatever. I mean, because we need a team. It's just like a personal trainer. Everybody knows how to exercise, but when somebody's right there helping you, we all need a team. So this is a great community. And thank you for letting me be a part of it and sharing with you all.
Thank you so much. I think we're nearing the end, and everyone, either it's dinner or lunch or breakfast for everyone. So Jerry, again, there's so many thanks coming through the chat, and I'm sure we'll get more as I post the recorded session. Feel free to email Jerry or myself. Again, as I mentioned, I really thank all of you. We didn't get to some questions, but I will get back to you on those. And yeah, again, really, really value these, and looking forward. There's 3 more sessions that have been scheduled and posted with dates and times. Please mark your calendars with those and save those. And we'll probably add a few more, just maybe moderated sessions that are full Q&A and no presentation, so we have more time with you, Jerry.
Right, and I just want to maybe allay a little bit of Eleanor's fears in terms of like maybe a constant intake of rice and in terms of it being inflammatory. I don't know, because it really will matter on what it's being paired with. So it's not that you can't have the rice or carbohydrates, but as long as you're getting a lot of good proteins and antioxidants mixed is okay. And in terms of indications for inflammatory issues, there are certain blood tests for, and even inflammation of the gut can be determined by certain compounds in stool tests. That would be a little bit more of something to discuss offline, but I just wanted to address that. Just having, the constancy of rice with every meal isn't necessarily going to equate to more inflammation if you're also getting good proteins and healthy fats and vegetables. That's it.
Okay, we got to copy that, Roger that.
Well, because you know what, food for the parents as well as the children. I mean, it's inherent in all these emotional issues, and you want to be doing the right thing, and food is also a comfort, so you want there to be enjoyment. So there's all this like judgment and guilt, and you know, and this is a judgment-free zone. Everybody's doing the best they can, and now we're just going to try to do it a little better. So
yeah, I agree. And keep in mind that we all have to think about ourselves in this perspective. And I think I always forget. I keep thinking about my daughter as I go through your slides and listen to you, but I'm like, wait, what about me? You know, and so I need this equally as well. And again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and we really look forward to continuing the series of webinars with you. So have a good rest of your weekend, all of you.
all of you, thank you. Until next time.
Thanks. Take care.
You too.
Bye, everyone.